Hi everyone, my name is Freya. I currently work as a content designer at the University of Edinburgh, and this evening I'll be talking through writing content for non-native English speakers, why the Write in Plain English rule matters. So to begin, I'd like to start with a story. So when I was in high school, a classmate of mine who'd recently moved from Germany and spoke German in his first language asked me a question during a written assignment. Now, he was fluent in English, but at the end of the assignment, he said, "Freya, what does it mean to draw a conclusion? Do I need to draw something?" Now, I was sitting close to this person, and so I could help him clarify what this word meant in this context. But imagine if somebody who was speaking English as a second language found an abstract word like this on a website. How might they respond? Would they be able to complete the task without asking for help? Would they get stuck? Or would they give up? And so the point I want to make here is the words on your website matter. The words you select need to be clear because otherwise we stop people from doing what they need to do and want to do. And such words can add some people to feel stressed, confused, frustrated, and just think this one task could be one of many tasks that they need to do to complete a goal. So this evening, this is just a quick overview of what I'll go through. So I'll go through a project background with my team and I did with the Student Immigration Service at the University of Edinburgh. I'll share some examples of how we applied the Write in Plain English rule, and I'll share some practical tips when writing content. And then lastly, there'll be some time for discussion. So in terms of some project background, so this was a content design project that my team and I worked on from January to June of last year. And we were working, as I said, with the Student Immigration Service. And so we were creating content for new international students and current students who needed to complete a student visa application as part of their student visa. And they needed to secure that before they could study at the University of Edinburgh. And this content included information around a checklist document and just various things that they needed to make sure that they had in place before they could secure their visa. And so on the right hand side here, I've just got some of our goals. So we wanted to enhance the experience for all international students using the service. We wanted to improve self-service content on the website so that students could find information more independently. And lastly, we wanted to reduce the number of inquiries to the team. So this was a really key goal for us. So what was really challenging in many ways with this content was, firstly, the student visa application process itself. It was really complicated, but we were also, we had to use very complex student visa language. And so here are some examples of that language that features throughout this application process. So a confirmation of acceptance for studies, also known as a CAS number, a biometric residence permit, also known as a BRP, a vignette, which is a visa sticker that goes in someone's passport, and an immigration health surcharge, also known as an IHS. And what makes this language even more complicated is that these acronyms are often used without their full title, and so that can add to even more confusion for users. And so as part of our role, we couldn't not use these terms because they were the official terms used by the UK government. So we had to find a way to integrate this sort of language while using plain English to make it easier for students to understand. So I'll just briefly talk through our content design process. So we followed an Agile Scrum methodology, and we followed the double diamond process to make sure that everything was user-centered. So if you're not familiar with an Agile Scrum methodology, this is Scrum is a project framework, and you have a list of tasks and deadlines to complete. And we would work intensely between 2 and 3 weeks at a time. And these periods of time were known as sprints. And so we'd prioritize the most important work that we needed to focus on in each sprint. So we focused on applying for a student visa outside the UK, and then we worked on applying for a student visa inside the UK. And as I mentioned, we followed the double diamond, and if many of you are already working in user-centered design, this will be very familiar to you. But if you're new to content design or user-centered design, this is a really great framework that allows you to zoom out of a problem and really kind of zoom in. So we went through each stage. So we started with the discovery, which was the research part of our project, where we spoke to stakeholders and students. And then we started to define the problem. looked at it a bit more closely, and then we sort of developed how we were going to solve those problems, those priority problems, and then we worked on some content, and then we ultimately delivered that and published it. So I should say that I am not a subject matter expert. I'd like to think that I'm an enthusiastic language learner, but I'm still very much learning. Still, I'm really excited to share my learnings with you. So yeah, first topic. So new international students need to navigate complex subject matter. And so imagine this scenario. Before you can become fully immersed in a language, you need to go through a really complex process to feel comfortable using that language. And in many ways, this is quite a challenging starting point, especially if you are using a different language. So maybe some of you can relate, maybe you speak multiple languages, and that process of switching between a language, maybe it takes a while for it to click. Or maybe you go overseas and you speak a different language, and it just takes a bit of time before you kind of adjust, before things become a bit more spontaneous and instant. And so this process of applying for a visa really adds an extra layer of complexity for new students. So before they can get excited and start their university journey, they have to go through something which is really complicated. And so for us as content designers, we didn't know how much exposure or how much exposure students had to English. And by that I mean how much they used it at school, how much they used it at home, whether they were familiar with American English or British English. And so we didn't know just how comfortable and confident students felt at this stage. But like I said, it's kind of a really challenging starting point before you can kind of become fully immersed in that language. So if anybody has applied for a visa, then you might know that it's a very emotive process. It can be very time sensitive. There's lots of different stages, and excuse me, and those stages, they really make a difference to the process as a whole. This kind of, we had to be very empathetic to this process in general, because obviously if people are in a more heightened state, emotional state, that will affect how they consume the content as well. So we had to be very mindful of that when we were creating this content. So what makes content more challenging? Well, firstly, I'll start with some more simple examples of how we applied the Write in Plain English rule, and then I'll move on to some more complex examples, and I'll show that it's not always so easy to apply this rule, and I'll explain why. So the first example I'd like to look at is when someone ignores content that they don't understand. So when we were doing our research and we spoke to students, we knew that this happened, that people would ignore content that they didn't understand. And this is understandable, and especially if you are using a second language. As content professionals, we might not like the idea that people will ignore our content, but this is a matter of fact. In many ways, if people are reading content online, they are likely to skip and just look for the information that they need. But we really didn't want to for people to ignore that content that would apply for that would apply to them. And so this is just an example to show how on the left-hand side here, there are all the different types of visas. And on the right-hand side is how we transformed it. So this is kind of what I was saying, that for the vast majority of students, they would be looking for a student visa. And so on the left-hand side, Hong Kong BNO visa, short-term study visa, standard visitor visa, and student visa. It kind of adds more content for something, and they might not recognize what those terms are. And so on the right-hand side, we just reduce those options to student visa and other types of visas. So the point I want to make here is there is a difference between understanding content and eliminating what does not apply to you versus clicking on something that seems familiar because you don't understand the other options. And so this was really important for us. We wanted to make sure that students would understand what would apply to them rather than avoid content because they didn't know if it applied to them. So what if you need to include unclear terms that your users might not understand or might not be familiar with? So in the project, we had to use terms that students might not be familiar with, like this one here, so prospective student. So we weren't able to change any terms throughout this project, and so we had to keep them. So we couldn't delete any university terms, but we could explain them with more context so that students could understand if it related to them or not. And so when we were creating the new inquiry form, we knew that these terms, like prospective student, were confusing to students when we were speaking to the staff. And so we wanted to make sure that we were adding more context and add words that weren't using those terms exactly. So we updated the inquiry form, and what we wanted to do was add more context, really. And we weren't able to delete this term prospective student because that would be confusing. And so what we did was we have on the inquiry form here a drop down menu. You can see there's prospective student or future student, and we have some help text which says, I've not yet started studying at the University of Edinburgh. And so we've added this term future student, which is not technically the correct term, but the reason we added it in was that students could understand with the help text if it applied to them or not. And so with these examples so far, I just wanted to sort of show how we've applied that rule. But I'm now going to move on to some more complex examples where applying that rule isn't so easy. And so I'll look at this question, which is, what if people are searching for a keyword, but they don't understand its meaning? So when we were in our research phase, we noticed, or we knew that there was some jargon that was confusing, or it wasn't confusing, but basically we knew that students were looking for a certain word, but they didn't maybe perhaps understand the meaning of that word. And so previously the text was bringing your family, and this was the phrase to help that jargon. The word was dependence, and so this phrase bringing your family was used instead. But actually what happened was it created more confusion because students were looking for a keyword, which was dependence. Excuse me. And so this word dependence is used by the UKVI, which is the official term. But actually, by removing that official term and replacing it with bringing your family made it actually harder. And so we weren't able to change that completely. We had to use that term. And so it's really important to understand that your content doesn't exist in isolation, as it will connect to other parts of an organization and external services. And so it's just really important to think about that wider servicescape. And so in this project, we weren't able to work on this content in particular, but we were able to update the title here. So we have dependence, we also have bringing your family as well. So we are able to have that that keyword in there that students will be looking for, but we're also able to add a bit more context as well. So the lesson here is, if users are scanning for a keyword, then we need to make sure that that keyword is in a place where they expect to find it. And so this is really important to think about the wider servicescape. As I said, it's really important if a keyword is used, say, by a central service, you need to make sure that you are using that word. And it might not be, and actually, you might need to override that write in plain English rule to really help your users as well. So how do you decide what word to use when there are lots of different words to use in the English language? So when I was researching for this talk, I started to think about how many words are in the English language. And there's approximately 171,000 according to the Oxford English Dictionary. And if you are if you're using English as your first language, you typically know around 15 to 20,000 word families. So a word family is a group of words that have similar meanings. And for people who are language learners, they need to know around 8 to 9,000 different word families. And so a word family could be something like to speak, so the verb to speak, I am speaking, speak up, public speaker, and so on. So when I say that people need to understand between 8 and 9,000, that's those words so that they can understand a whole range of written content. But of course, some words are more widely used than others, and so that kind of maybe makes a difference in terms of how words are more recognizable than others. So when we were working on this project, my team and I were redeveloping the contact page, and we needed to explain what type of help was available. And so the team told us that the immigration advisors weren't able to give advice over the phone. So they couldn't give specific advice relating to an individual, but staff could answer general advice over the phone. And so with that in mind, we created a piece of content like this that explained that. So we are not able to provide advice over the phone. So this tool here is Hemingway. So it's a free tool which helps you with your content, and it's a great way to test the readability. And the lower the score, that means that it's understood by a wider audience. And so if I copy and paste the phrase, we are not able to provide advice over the phone, it gives a score of 2, which in theory is really good. It means that it's understood by a wider population. But it's not always, you can't always rely on tools like Hemingway because you need to think about things in a wider context. And I'd like to share a conversation that I had with a colleague of mine who speaks Spanish as her first language. And she said to me, if somebody who doesn't speak English as their first language read this, it would sound like no help is available. And she's right, because the word advice could be translated to help. So it might sound like no help is available for somebody who is looking for it and they need that. And so during this conversation, I said, what about we use the word guidance instead? And my rationale for using the word guidance was that I thought that it was less bespoke and it was sort of more general. And interestingly, she said this: if I think back to my level of English when I was a student in the UK, I'm not sure if I would have been able to see the distinction between advice and guidance. Now I see it, but back then I wouldn't have been able to. And so after we had this conversation, we worked together on a piece of content to update the contact page. And in this screenshot here, I've just highlighted the section that we worked on based on that conversation. So we can only help with general questions on the phone. If you need more specialist immigration advice, contact us with the form provided. Excuse me. And so hopefully this reduces some of the anxiety for students so that they do know that there is help available. And this explains it in a way that's much better than what we had previously. So I think it's important to think about how information can be perceived and translated by other language users. And I think oftentimes if we use very specific or very detailed words in English, such as advice and guidance, it can actually add more ambiguity because these subtle differences just don't exist in other languages, or maybe it takes somebody a little bit more time to recognize those subtle differences. So how could you help users who need to interact with more complex process or a complex language in their second language? So I'd like to share some of my tips. So firstly, I would say it's really important, if you can, to get feedback from someone who speaks English as a second language. So that could be a friend, a colleague. And I think it's really beneficial because these people will be able to help you look at the context or look at the content through a different lens. And I think that's really helpful if English is your first language, or maybe you have little or no experience of using a different language. And personally, when we had this conversation together, it was really a significant moment in the project for me, and I felt it was really, really valuable. And whenever I would ask my colleague for her feedback, it was always really interesting to see just how she worked. So she would often delete unnecessary words. So here's an example here. Before we had, I have applied, I've not yet applied. And after we had, I have applied, I have not yet applied. Sorry, I have not applied. And so this example shows that, you know, sometimes we don't need all that granular detail and that really, really those specific words. And I think if something can be simplified and, you know, they're very, very similar, I think it makes sense to delete those unnecessary words. And so the key takeaway, your content needs to be precise and concise rather, and to the point. And this is really, really important, especially if it is going to be translated. My second tip, if you can, simplify words wherever possible. And so, yeah, don't add any extra complexity or any extra details. And I think this is really important to go back to the point about some words are more widely used than others. The first example here, we noticed when we were reworking a lot of the content that this word commence would appear in lots of different places. And so, you know, you should commence your application as soon as possible. It's not ideal. And so we reworked it to you should start your application as soon as possible. And so I think it's really important just to think about replacing words which are more commonly used. And so, yes, as I've said, selecting advanced or specific words can really help, or can cause people to feel quite lost and frustrated. So yeah, if you are able to use a simpler word, and I would say don't worry if it is less precise in English, because I think a simpler word is really just the best. Next tip, if you must use terminology, then add a clear explanation. If you're not able to change the word of a service, then I think it's really important to add more context around that. So during this project, we were creating content for the things that students needed to do once they arrived in the UK and were about to start their studies. And so they needed to go to something called international check-in. And we realized from our research that this check-in part wasn't so clear. And so we needed to provide more context around this word. And so on the right-hand side here, this is the content that we created. So when you get to the UK or extend your visa in the UK, you need to check your passport and immigration permission. Most students need to book and attend an appointment at the university, and you'll receive an email about what to do for international check-in before you arrive. And so my key takeaway is your explanation ideally should be brief and contain only key information that is relevant to your user. And so, yeah, with this example, we didn't want to add any extra details that weren't going to be helpful for them, because they really just needed to know exactly what was going to be important for them at that moment in time. And my final tip is change localized words or expressions. So on the left-hand side here, I've just made up this example to sort of illustrate the point. So we can't accept applications out with the deadline. So if you're not familiar with this term out with, it's widely used in Scotland, and it's used to describe something that is outside of a limit or a barrier, and it tends to be used in relation to time. And the reason I wanted to include this is I think it's really important to just see how a word that is used very, very localized or in a very specific area can actually be quite meaningless if people are not familiar with it, or they've never been exposed to this sort of word before. And so I think it's really important to just be really mindful if you are using sort of more localized phrases and words. And I think that's why, again, it's really important to get that feedback from people who don't speak English as a second language, or indeed very important to test all of your content before it goes live. And another example here, you will get a reply within 5 working days, but not during the summer. Again, just made this example to illustrate the point. So I think it's really interesting, or it's really important rather, to make sure that if you are using a word like working day, that it's really important to consider how that might be understood in other parts of the world, because obviously the concept of a working day can really vary around the world. And I think this really has implications on expectations as well. So a user might expect something within a different time frame because of their reference point. So I think it's really important, if you are using something like working day, to just really define what you mean by that. And I think secondly, it's really important to not use any reference to summer. I think in higher education, it's quite common to sort of talk about the summer term or the winter term, but I think it's really important to remember that your users might be living in all sorts of, all around the world. And so their reference point of what is a summer and winter will just be different. So yeah, key takeaway, just not make your content, make sure that the words and expressions that you use are not too specific to one country and region. And again, that's really just important to ask for feedback and test your content before it goes live. Okay, so in summary, I want to say that when it comes to the Write in Plain English rule, the subtle details do matter. And just think, all of these words that we're adding to the content, they really can make a difference to how somebody who is speaking English as a second language, how they scan that content, how they comprehend that content, how they complete a task. And I think the sum total of all of these small changes can really reduce the effort for all of your users, and not just those people who speak English as a second language. And so, yes, it's important to apply the Write in Plain English rule, but it's also important to go beyond the rule. And that is me. So thank you very much. And yes, if you want to connect, my LinkedIn is just Freya Cookson.